The fence post was lying in the dirt again. Rosalind Hale pressed her hand against the splintered wood and felt something cold move through her chest. Not the cold of the Kansas morning, not the bite of the October wind coming down off the ridge. Something deeper. Something that lived in the space between what she knew and what she was only beginning to suspect. She had fixed this post herself 3 days ago. She had dug the hole with her own blistered hands, packed the earth tight around the base, tested it with both palms. It had held. It should still be holding. But now it lay in the yellow grass like it had never stood at all, and the strange thing, the thing that made her throat tighten, was that the break was clean. The wood at the base was not rotted. The earth around it had not washed away. Someone had pulled it up and someone had put it back down, but not quite in the same position. Close, nearly perfect, but not quite. Rosalind stood up slowly and looked out across the half-mile of open land between her ranch house and the tree line where the cedar and cottonwood crowded together along Bitter Creek. The sun was barely above the hills. The light was thin and gray and honest. Nobody was there. Nobody had been there. But somebody had been. She had been watching that fence for 2 weeks. She had told herself she was imagining things, that grief did strange work on a woman's mind, that 8 months of running this ranch alone had made her see patterns where there were none. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead since February. Dead and buried under the oak tree at the south corner of the property, where he had always said the light was best in the evenings. She was 26 years old, and she had 140 acres and a mortgage and a broken fence that kept fixing itself in the night. She had not told a soul, not because she was afraid, exactly. She had grown up in Kansas. She understood that fear was a tool you picked up when you needed it and set down when you did not. What she felt was something more complicated than fear. It was the vertigo of knowing that someone was watching over you without your permission, without your knowledge, and the maddening impossibility of deciding whether that was a threat or a mercy. She picked up the fence post. She set it in the hole. She packed the earth with the heel of her boot. Then she went inside and loaded her rifle and sat at the kitchen window and waited. He did not come that night. He did not come the next night either. It was not until the third night, a Tuesday, moonless and black, that she heard it. The softest sound in the world. The tap of a hammer muffled under cloth. The careful, deliberate silence of a man who had learned to work as though the world was sleeping and needed to stay that way. She did not go outside. She sat in the dark with her rifle across her knees, and she listened to the sounds of her fence being repaired, and she tried to understand what kind of man did such a thing, and why, and what it meant that she was sitting here in the dark letting him. She had seen Yael Farrow only twice since Thomas died. Once at the funeral, standing at the back of the small crowd, his hat in his hands, his face unreadable as stone. Once on the road into Caldwell, passing her wagon without stopping, though she had seen him glance at her in the moment before he looked away. He was known in the county as a man who kept to himself. He had a reputation that arrived in a room before he did, quiet and dark and unavoidable as smoke. He had ridden for several cattle operations over the years, worked as a scout for a time, and the town said other things about him too. Things spoken in lower voices that she had never fully been able to confirm. What she knew for certain was that he had bought the piece of land adjoining hers from the Harmon estate 6 months before Thomas died, and that he had been there, alone, every day since, doing something with the land that nobody could quite agree on. She lay awake for a long time after the hammering stopped. She told herself she would confront him. She told herself she would thank him. She told herself she would tell him to stop. She did not do any of those things, not yet. Yael Farrow had not meant to be seen. That was the point. That had always been the point. He had first noticed the fence 2 months ago in late August, when he was coming back from Caldwell along the ridge road that ran parallel to her south pasture. He had not been looking for anything. He had been doing what he always did, which was watching the land the way other men watched cards, looking for tells. And the tell that afternoon had been a gap in the fence line, a whole section listing sideways in the heat, and the woman herself on her knees in the grass trying to drive a post with a mallet that was too light for the work. He had kept riding. He had told himself it was not his business. He had told himself the same thing 4 more times over the course of the following week. Each time he passed that stretch of fence and saw it had gotten worse instead of better. He had told himself it was not his place, that she did not know him, that a widow alone on a property did not need a stranger appearing at her fence with tools and intentions she had no reason to trust. He knew what he looked like. He knew what people said. He was 31 years old, and he had lived a life that left marks, and not all of those marks were ones he was proud of. He had worked for men who turned out to be worse than he knew when he hired on. He had been present at things he wished he could be present at. He had done what he had to do to survive, and he had drawn a line somewhere in the last few years and set himself down on the right side of it and tried to stay there. Tried being the operative word. The fence was a small thing. That was what he told himself the first night he came out after midnight with a post driver and a coil of wire. A small thing. A neighbor thing. Anonymous and harmless. He worked by feel in the dark. He had done enough work in enough conditions to know how to read ground and wood and wire without light. He fixed 3 posts that first night, tamped the earth, straightened the wire, and was gone before 3 in the morning. He felt something he had not felt in a long time when he walked back across the creek to his own property. Not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter than that. Something with edges he could not quite identify. He came back the following week, and the week after that. He told himself each time that it would be the last time. That the fence was in reasonable shape now, and she would manage the rest. That he had done enough of whatever small, invisible thing it was he thought he was doing. But then the autumn rains came, and the posts shifted in the softened earth, and a length of wire pulled loose along the north stretch, and he found himself back in the dark with his tools, working as quietly as a man could work, and the whole time he was aware, in some deep and uncomfortable way, that this was not just about the fence. He did not let himself examine that awareness too closely. Then came the Tuesday night when he was halfway through replacing a rotted post, and he realized, with absolute certainty, that the light in the kitchen window was not a lantern left burning. It was a lamp that had been moved to the window. The kind of thing you did when you wanted to see out into the dark while being hidden from it. She was there. She was watching, or listening at least. Sitting in the dark with whatever she had, which he suspected was the Springfield he had noticed leaning against the door frame the one time he had ridden close enough to the house to see that much. He finished the post. He kept his movements measured and unhurried. He put his tools back in the leather bag. He walked back to the creek without varying his pace by a single step. He lay awake until dawn. The next morning he saddled his horse and rode the long way around the property, the way that did not take him past her fence, and told himself he was going to stop. That she knew. That the arrangement, such as it was, had been discovered, and that whatever silent understanding had existed between them in the dark was over now. He kept telling himself that for 6 days. On the 7th day, he rode into Caldwell for supplies, and he was loading flour and salt and lamp oil into his saddlebag outside Durst's Mercantile when he heard her voice. She was inside the store. He could see her through the glass in the door, talking to Arthur Durst, the proprietor, a round man of 50 with a permanent ink stain on his right hand. She was asking about the price of wire, fence wire, the kind used for livestock perimeters. He heard Arthur tell her the price. He heard her go quiet for a moment in the way people went quiet when a number was too high. Then he heard her say she would have to think about it. He put his hand on the door handle. He stood there for 3 seconds. He went around to the side entrance that led to the storage room, where Arthur kept accounts, and he paid for 20 feet of good fence wire, and had it added to the delivery that Arthur sent out to the North properties on Fridays. He put it under the name of a supply account he had set up when he first bought the land. Not his own name, a business name, something neutral. He rode home without going back past the front of the store. He did not think about why he had done it in quite those terms. He did not use any of the words that might have been available to him. He kept to the practical. The fence needed wire. The wire had been purchased. That was the shape of it. Rosalind found the wire on her porch on Friday afternoon with a card that said only the name of a supply company she did not recognize, and underneath it, in someone's plain handwriting, delivery in full. No charge. She stood on her porch for a long time with the wire in her hands. Then she walked around to the south pasture and looked at the fence, really looked at it for the first time since August, and she saw what it had become. Not perfect, not professional, but solid, deliberate. Someone had spent real time and real care on this fence and done it in the dark, so she would never know. The realization hit her differently than she expected. Not as violation, not as threat. As something she had no clean name for, something that moved through her slowly and left her standing in the grass with her throat aching and her hands trembling slightly around the coil of wire she had been managing. She had told herself every single day that she was managing. The ranch, the mortgage, the cattle, the absence of Thomas, which was its own particular weight she carried differently on different days. She had been managing all of it quietly, alone in the Kansas way, which meant not asking and not showing and not needing. She had believed herself when she said it, but someone had seen through it. Someone had looked at her fence and looked at her life and done a small, silent, hidden thing out of the dark, and the reason she was standing here trembling was not fear. It was not gratitude exactly either. It was the unbearable tenderness of being seen. She made her decision then. She was going to find out who it was, and she was going to look at them directly, and then she was going to decide what to do. She already suspected. But suspicion was not the same as knowing. She sent a letter to the land office in Caldwell, asking for the name of the account holder on the property east of hers. The letter came back 3 days later with the information she expected. Yael Farrow. The land had been purchased in April of the prior year from the Harmon estate, as she had known. There was a house on it, modest, and various improvements made since purchase. She also, somewhat against her own better judgment, asked Martha Coles, who was the closest thing Caldwell had to a civic memory, what she knew about the man. Martha was a woman of 60 who had been running the boarding house on 2nd Street since, before Rosalind was born, and she had an opinion on everyone, and was not shy about sharing them. Yael Farrow, Martha said, settling into her chair with the expression of someone being asked about a complicated piece of weather, was not a bad man. Not by her reading. He had stayed at the boarding house twice in the years before he bought his land, and he had been quiet and paid on time and never gave trouble. There were stories, Martha said. Old stories, the kind that followed a man when he had spent time in certain kinds of work. There was something about the Hendricks operation, a big cattle concern up near Wichita, a situation that had gone badly and left several men dead, and Yael Farrow walking away from it with nothing. There was another story about a man in Dodge City, a gambler who had tried to use Yael in some scheme and ended up regretting it. The details varied depending on who was telling the story. The consistent part was that Yael Farrow was a man who had been used for other men's dark purposes more than once and had, at some point, stopped allowing it. He was not wanted anywhere that Martha knew of. He was not a violent man by nature. He was a careful man. The kind who thought before he moved and meant what he did. Rosalind folded that information away carefully and rode home. She fixed the section of wire herself that weekend, in the daylight, with her own hands, in a deliberate and visible way. She wanted him to see it if he was watching, which she believed he was. She wanted him to know that she knew something, even if not everything, and that she was not afraid. She was not afraid. What she was furious. Not at him exactly, at herself. At the way her mind kept returning to the image of him working in the dark, patient and careful, doing a thing for her that he never intended her to know about. At the way that image made her feel things she had not expected to feel since Thomas died. Things she was not sure she was ready to feel. Thomas had been a good man, a steady man. He had not been the love of her life in the way that phrase was used in the novels she had read when she was young, and had not yet understood the difference between the story and the thing itself. He had been real and kind and present, and she had loved him in the real and present way, and his death had left her diminished in a practical and specific way that she mourned honestly. She did not glamorize it. She did not make it into something larger than it was. But she was 26 years old, and there was a man on the other side of the creek who worked in her darkness without asking anything in return. That, she thought, was its own kind of thing entirely. She decided to speak to him. The opportunity came 2 weeks later, not as she had planned, not in any of the controlled ways she had imagined the conversation, but at the general store again, on a Thursday morning when she was reaching for a tin of coffee on the top shelf, and a hand appeared beside hers and took it down without comment and set it on the counter. She turned around. Yael Farrow was taller than she remembered. He was a lean, dark-haired man with a face that had been weathered without being ruined, with quiet gray eyes that did not look away when she looked at him. He was wearing a plain canvas coat and his hat was pushed back slightly. He did not look like a man who had been doing anything secretive. He looked like a man who had handed a woman a tin of coffee and was waiting to see what happened next. "Thank you," she said. "Sure," he said. He started to move past her toward the back of the store. "Mr. Farrow," she said. He stopped. His back was to her. She watched him take a breath. She watched him turn around. "I know it's you," she said, very quietly, because Arthur Durst was at the counter pretending to arrange ledgers and there were 2 other women in the dry goods aisle, and this was not a conversation she was willing to perform for an audience. "The fence." He looked at her for a long moment. His face did not change in any dramatic way, but something in his eyes shifted. Not guilt exactly. Something more honest than guilt. "I'm sorry if it was unwelcome," he said. "It wasn't," she said. That stopped him. She held his gaze. She was aware of how her heart was beating, steady and loud and too fast, and she was not going to give that away. "I'd like to understand why," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who didn't have an answer. The quiet of someone who had an answer and was deciding how honest to be. "Neighbor thing," he said. "No, it wasn't," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression changed, went softer in some way that she suspected he rarely allowed. He said, "No, it wasn't." She nodded. "All right," she said. "I'm making supper tonight. If you want to come, you're welcome to." She turned and paid for her coffee and walked out of the store. She stood outside in the October sun and breathed. Her hands were perfectly steady. She did not know where that had come from. She suspected it had been building for weeks, in all those nights of listening to the hammer in the dark, in all those mornings of going out to find the fence more solid than she had left it. She drove home. She made bread. She put a pot of beans on in the early afternoon. She set 2 plates on the table. At 6:05, she heard a horse in the yard. She did not run to the window. She finished turning the bread and then she went to the door and opened it. He was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, which was the same way he had stood at the back of the funeral crowd, and she remembered noticing that then without knowing she had noticed it. He had a bottle of something in his other hand, wine, dark glass, and she recognized the label as the one that came from the small shop next to the Caldwell land office. "Come in," she said. He came in. He set the wine on the table. He looked around her kitchen without appearing to look at it, the way careful people surveyed spaces, and then he hung his coat and hat on the peg beside the door and sat down where she indicated. They ate supper together. It was the strangest meal she had eaten in years, and also somehow the most comfortable. He was not a man who filled silence artificially. He talked when he had something to say and did not when he didn't, and she found that restful in a way she hadn't expected. She asked him about his land, what he was doing with it, and he told her he was trying to establish a small cattle operation, modest, sustainable, not the kind that chewed up land and left it bare. He had a philosophy about land use that he explained carefully and with genuine conviction, and she listened and told him where she agreed and where she thought he was wrong, and he listened to that too. She asked him about the Hendricks operation. She asked it directly over the wine, looking at him. He put down his glass. He looked at the table for a moment. He said, "Where did you hear that, Martha Coles?" He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Martha Coles knows a version of it," he said. "What's the actual version?" He was quiet for a while. Then he told her. The Hendricks operation had been exactly what it appeared to be on the surface, a large cattle enterprise, well-funded, well-connected, moving beef north from Texas along established trails. He had hired on as a trail boss at 26, 5 years ago. He had done his job. Somewhere in the second year, he began to understand that the operation was not entirely about cattle, that there were things moving through the network that were not cattle, that certain transactions were happening at certain stops along the trail that did not appear in any ledger he was shown. He had asked questions. He had been warned explicitly to stop asking. He had asked again, and this time he had gotten enough of an answer to understand that leaving was the only decent option available to him. 3 men had died in the collapse of the Hendricks operation. He had not been responsible for any of those deaths. He had been present at one of them and not been able to prevent it, which was a different kind of thing, and he said this with a flatness that told her it was still a weight he carried. "You've been hiding ever since," she said. He looked at her. "I've been careful," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Hiding means you stop living," he said. "I bought the land. I'm building something. That's not hiding." She looked at him. She said, "Then why do you fix my fence in the dark?" The question landed differently than the others. She saw him absorb it. She saw something move across his face, the same something she had seen in the store, that guarded honesty she was coming to recognize as specifically his. "Because I wanted to help," he said, "and I didn't think you'd want it from me." "Why not?" He looked at her. "Because of what I am," he said. "What people say I am." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to tell you what I think, and you can do what you like with it. I think you spent years being useful to bad people, and you got out, and the marks it left on you are the kind you carry in, not out. I think you're not a violent man by nature. I think you've been alone a long time, and so have I, and you were kind to me in the dark when you thought I wouldn't know, which tells me more about you than whatever version of your history Martha Coles has got." He was very still. "That's what I think," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Thomas Hale was a good man. It was not what she expected. She felt the familiar pressure of grief, present and manageable, and she said, yes. I'm sorry, he said. I know, she said. She did know. She had seen his face at the funeral. They sat with that for a while. How did you know him? She asked. Worked a spring drive together in '81, he said. Before he settled here. He talked about the land, talked about what he wanted to build. He was specific about it, the way people are when they've thought about something long and hard. He knew exactly what he wanted. He did, she said. He told me once, Yael said, and stopped. What? He looked at her. He told me he'd married the most capable woman in Kansas. She felt that in the back of her throat. She looked at the table. She said he was being generous. He didn't sound like he was being generous, Yael said. He sounded like he was stating a fact. She picked up her wine glass. She looked at the dark liquid in it for a moment. She said, you knew him well enough to carry that. We were only on the trail together 6 weeks, he said. But some men you know well in a short time. She nodded. She understood that. She had known Thomas was the person she was going to share her life with in the first 2 weeks. She had not always understood the shape of that life, had sometimes found it smaller and harder than she had expected, but the knowing had been immediate and sure. She said, when did you buy the land next to mine? April of last year, he said. Before he died. Did you know whose land it was? No, he said. Not at first. He paused. I found out in November, after the deed was settled. And you stayed. I stayed, he said. He said it simply, without loading it with meaning, but the simplicity of it was its own kind of weight. She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was warm, and the kitchen smelled like bread and beans. And she was sitting across from a man who had known her husband and bought land beside hers before Thomas died, and then spent the autumn fixing her fence in the dark so she would not see him work. And she could feel the shape of something forming between them. Something she had not been looking for and was not entirely sure she was ready for. But that felt, in some undeniable way, like the truth. She did not act on it, not that night. She was not that kind of impulsive, and she did not think he was either. He left after supper, taking his coat and hat from the peg, and paused at the door. Mrs. Hale, he said. Rosalind, she said. A brief pause. Rosalind. You're welcome to come back, she said. To supper, not to the fence in the daylight. He almost smiled. She could see it at the edge of his mouth, contained and careful. All right, he said. He came back on Saturday. He came with a pan of something wrapped in cloth, which turned out to be cornbread. And she took it from him and tasted it and told him it was good. And he said his mother had taught him, and she had been particular about it. This was the first time he had mentioned his mother, and she stored the information away. They ate lunch in the pale autumn sun on the porch, which felt more natural than the kitchen had, less enclosed, and she asked him about his mother, and he said she had died when he was 16, which was why he had gone to work early, gone to work for the kind of operations that hired young men without too many questions. She did not pity him. She said it sounded like he had done what was needed, and he nodded. She told him about growing up in the county, about her father who had homesteaded the original 40 acres and spent the rest of his life expanding it by increments, about her mother who had been formidable and funny and dead of fever when Rosalind was 19, about learning to run the land from her father who died the year after she married Thomas, which she had always thought was his way of ensuring she had someone to keep the land going before he left it. She talked for a long time. She hadn't realized how much she had been carrying unsaid. He listened in a way that was not passive, that was active and attentive, occasionally asking a question that showed he had been paying attention to the details. You're good at listening, she said. It's the only thing I was told I was good at growing up, he said, which made her laugh, and she saw something happen in his face at the sound of that, some unguarded flash of pleasure that was gone almost immediately. She noticed it. She filed it away. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. And by the third week it was not just Tuesdays. It was also Saturdays and once on a Thursday when he was passing. And she was wrestling with a stuck door hinge, and he stopped without being asked and helped. And they stood very close together in the narrow doorway, and neither of them said anything significant, but both of them were very aware of the closeness and the heat of it. He began staying longer each time, not in an inappropriate way, in the way of someone who was in no hurry and found a particular place worth remaining in. He helped her with small things around the property, genuinely, in the daylight. And she let him because she needed the help, and because watching him work was something she was not going to examine too carefully. The way his hands were precise and patient with whatever they handled, the way he moved around the land as though he was considering it. He told her, one afternoon in early November while they were restringing a section of the east fence together, that the Hendricks collapse had left him with nothing. Not just no money, he clarified, but no clear sense of who he was when he wasn't being useful to someone else's purpose. He had spent a year working odd jobs and living out of a bedroll and trying to figure out what he actually wanted as opposed to what he had been putting up with. And, she said, land, he said. Of my own, something I built. She handed him the wire stretcher. Their fingers overlapped briefly. Neither of them moved back immediately. Is that all? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, pulling the wire taut. No, he said. Not all. She did not push it. She went back to tamping the post, but she was smiling at the ground and she did not try especially hard to hide it. November deepened, and the land went brown and quiet and cold. There was a day in mid-November when a stranger appeared on the road at the south boundary of Rosalind's property. A man on a gray horse, sitting there watching the house for long enough that she noticed and went out with her rifle. She told Yael about it that evening. His face changed in a particular way. Not dramatically, but specifically in the way it changed when something tripped an internal alarm he kept carefully concealed. What did he look like? He said. She described the man. Tall, heavy-set, reddish beard, gray horse, wearing a good coat. He was quiet for a moment. Did he come onto the property? No. He sat at the road and then he left. How long? Maybe 10 minutes. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard. She watched his back and felt the change in the room and said, Yael. He turned around. Is that someone from the Hendricks business? She said. He looked at her. Then he said, I don't know for certain, but you think. There was a man, he said carefully, connected to that operation. A man named Decker Crane. He was not one of the 3 who died. He was the kind of man who does not forget when someone walks away from something he was involved in. I had believed he had moved on to other things. It's possible I was wrong. She absorbed this. She said, what does he want? I'm not sure, he said. If it's him, it may be nothing. Yael, she said. I have been alone on this property for 8 months. I am not fragile and I do not need to be protected from information. What does he want? He looked at her for a moment, something in his expression that she could only call a kind of gratitude for being spoken to directly. Then he said, there were ledgers. Records of the transactions I mentioned, the ones that were not cattle. I knew they existed. I didn't take them when I left. I didn't touch them, but the man who did take them, who turned them over to the authorities in Wichita, had worked with me for 2 years. Crane may believe I know where those records came from or that I have copies. Do you? No, he said flatly. I have nothing. I never did. Then the solution, she said, is to talk to him. He looked at her. That's not generally how Decker Crane operates. Then what do you suggest? He was quiet. She could see him working through it. He said, if it is Crane and if he's watching the property, it means he knows where I am. I've been careful for 3 years, but I've not been particularly hidden. The land purchase is a matter of public record. He found me if he was looking. Then running won't help. No. So you deal with it here. He looked at her. Rosalind, if Crane comes to this property, I don't want you involved in it. It's my property, she said. I'm already involved in it. Something moved across his face. He sat back down. He ran a hand through his hair, which she had not seen him do before, a rare evidence of something disrupting his composure. He said, I'm sorry. If this has followed me here, I'm sorry. Don't apologize yet, she said. Let's first confirm it's even him. Over the following 3 days, they were careful. She went about her business as usual. He was visible on his own property, working, making no attempt to hide his presence. She kept her rifle accessible without making it obvious. On the 4th day, a man rode up the main road to her gate. The same man. Gray horse, reddish beard. He called out from the gate asking if the Farrow property was the one east of here. She came out onto the porch and told him it was. She had her rifle in her hands, not raised, just present. He looked at her for a moment. He said his name was Hollies. He was from the county assessor's office. He was checking boundary records on several properties in the north quarter of the county due to a resurveying project. He had been passed on several days because the road was marked wrong on his map. He was very ordinary about it. He showed her a document with the county seal. She looked at the document. She said he was welcome to check with Mr. Farrow directly. He thanked her and rode east. She stood on the porch until her heart rate returned to normal. When Yael came over that evening, she told him about the county assessor. She told him what the man had said, that it was likely routine, that she thought it genuinely was. And she watched him absorb that information and watched the tension he had been carrying for 4 days release itself from his shoulders in a gradual and visible way. He sat down in the kitchen chair and put his face in his hands for a moment. Just a moment. She sat down across from him. She said, Is it still always going to be like this for you? He looked up. What do you mean? I mean, is there always going to be a possibility of a man with a dark past appearing on the road and you wondering if your past has come to collect something? He considered this honestly. Probably not always, he said. There was a time when yes, probably. But the Hendricks business is 5 years old. The people involved are mostly scattered or settled. Crane is a real concern, but I've had no direct indication he's looked for me. I was overcautious. You were scared, she said, not unkindly. Yes, he said. She appreciated that he didn't argue with it. She looked at him across the table and thought about what it meant to carry that kind of history. To be a man who had done no wrong himself, but had been adjacent to wrong long enough that the smell of it hadn't entirely washed off, who had bought a piece of land and tried to build something clean and lived with the constant low anxiety that the past was not finished with him. She thought about Thomas, who had been a man without that particular weight, a simpler history, and how she had loved that simplicity while sometimes feeling that it left certain depths unplumbed. She said, Tell me something good about your land. What are you building? He blinked. He was not expecting the shift in direction. December arrived and the temperature dropped hard, and the first snow came before the middle of the month, soft and heavy, covering the land in a hush that made every sound carry farther. She found him on her porch one morning before she had even lit the stove, clearing the ice that had formed on the boards overnight, and she opened the door and looked at him, and he looked at her, and she felt the full absurdity and rightness of it simultaneously. You are still doing things to my property without being asked, she said. Yes, he said. I have asked you not to do that. You asked me not to fix the fence at night, he said. You didn't say anything about the ice. She felt laughter rise up in her chest and she held it back barely. She said, Come in and have coffee. He came in. He had coffee. He sat at her table in the early morning light with his coat hung up, and his hair unsettled from the cold, and she thought, standing at the stove with her back to him, that she was in serious danger of something she had not anticipated and was not sure she could manage. Christmas came. Walking back to where their horses were tied afterward, their breath visible in the frozen air, she said, "You're very good at being unreadable." "I've had practice," he said. "Martha Coles is already writing a story about us," she said. "I know," he said. "Does that bother you?" He looked at her. The moonlight was very clear on the snow. His face was all silver edges and shadow. He said, "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "No, I don't think it does." He was quiet. Then he said, "Good." She took her horse's reins. She turned to face him. She said, "Yael, what are we doing?" He held her gaze. He said, "I think we're doing the thing where two people figure out whether the thing between them is what it feels like." "And what does it feel like?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. The snow around them was perfectly still. There was no wind. The sound of the town behind them was muffled and distant, like something I didn't expect to find, he said. "And I'm not sure I deserve." She stepped closer to him, not dramatically, just closer. She said, "You fixed my fence in the dark for 2 months because you wanted to help and didn't think you had the right to offer. You fed my neighbor's cattle when the north gate blew open in October. I found out about that, by the way, from Ed Harmon, who mentioned a man fitting your description. You have been kind and careful and present for 4 months, and you think you don't deserve something good." He was very still. "You are wrong about that," she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached out and took her hand, carefully, exactly as he did everything, with that deliberate patience, and held it in both of his for a moment. His hands were warm despite the cold. She could feel every callus and scar. "I am trying," he said, "to do this right." "I know," she said. "I can see that." They stood there in the moonlit snow for a while longer than they needed to. Then they rode home, on separate horses, in separate directions, and she lay awake in her cold bedroom for 2 hours thinking about the warmth of his hands. January was brutal that year. The cold came down from the north and stayed, and there were 3 days when she could not get outside at all, when the wind made the walls shake and the snow piled up against the south windows. She kept the stove burning and read and mended and thought too much. On the 4th day, the weather broke, and she dug out and found Yael coming across the creek with a sled piled with firewood, because he had apparently assumed her supply was low, which it was. She helped him unload it without comment. Standing in her woodshed, their breath fogging in the cold air, surrounded by the smell of cedar and pine, she said, "How did you know I was running low?" "I guessed," he said. "On what basis?" "On the basis that I calculated how much would a house this size burns in a week of this cold, and then counted the cords you had in October and did the subtraction." She looked at him. "You were calculating my woodpile." It seemed relevant. "Why?" He turned to look at her. He was very close in the small shed. She was entirely aware of how close. He said, "Because I think about your situation. I think about whether you are warm and whether you have what you need and whether this winter is harder for you than it needs to be. That is apparently something I do. I don't think I can stop it." She looked at him in the dim light of the woodshed. She said, "Then don't." She reached up and put her hand against his face, the cold leather of her glove against his jaw, and he went completely still, every part of him, like an animal that has heard a sound and is deciding what it means. She felt his breath change. He turned his face into her hand slightly, the barest amount, the smallest involuntary thing, and that small involuntary movement broke the last careful distance between them. He kissed her, or she kissed him. It was not entirely clear who moved first, and it did not matter. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was careful and certain and warm in the cold of the woodshed, and she felt the weeks and months of all that careful distance collapse into a single moment of pure recognition. This is the thing. This is the real thing, and she had not been wrong about it. When they drew back, they were both quiet for a moment. "I have been wanting to do that since October," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew." "I could see it," she said. "You're better at being unreadable with other people." He almost laughed. She felt it through his chest where her hand was resting. She thought, "I want to feel that laugh all the way through." He said, "Rosalind." "Yes, I want to be honest with you about something." She waited. "I came to this county for the land," he said. "That was the whole truth of why I came. I didn't know Thomas was your husband when I bought. I found out later. And then I stayed because of the land and because I was building something, and I told myself that was all it was. But I was also staying because of you. And I have been doing everything I could to help you while keeping enough distance that you didn't have to feel the weight of it." "I felt the weight of it," she said gently. "From the first morning I found the fence post back in the ground." He absorbed that. "I should have introduced myself properly months ago. You were figuring out how," she said. "So was I." He looked at her. "You are the most straightforward person I have ever met." "I'm not," she said. "I have plenty of complications. I am just tired of pretending I don't know things that I know." He nodded. He took her hand from where it had been resting on his chest and held it again, the way he had in the snow on Christmas night. He said, "What do you know?" She looked at him. She said, "I know that this is not going to be simple, that you have a history that isn't clean and I have a grief that isn't finished. I know that we are both people who have been managing alone for too long, and that has made us both stubborn and self-sufficient in ways that might make this harder. I know that you are a good man and that I trust you, which I don't say lightly. And I know that I have not felt this clearly about another person since I was 22 years old, and Thomas Hale told me what he wanted to build." He was very still. "I also know," she said, "that you are standing in my woodshed holding my hand and looking at me like I am something you are afraid to damage, and I need you to know that I am not breakable. I have been running this ranch alone in a Kansas winter since February. You can look at me like I'm real." He looked at her. Something in his face came open in a way she had not seen before. Some final guard lowered. And what was underneath was not the darkness she might have feared given his history, but something simpler and more vulnerable. A man who wanted something good and had spent a long time not believing he was allowed to have it. He pulled her into him and held her properly, both arms, her face against his shoulder, and she let herself be held, which was something she had not let anyone do in a very long time, and they stood like that in the cold woodshed for a while. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." February came, and with it the anniversary of Thomas's death. She spent the morning at the grave under the oak tree at the south corner, in the cold morning light, talking to him as she sometimes did, telling him about the ranch, about the fence, about Yael. She was not sure if she believed Thomas could hear her. She thought it didn't matter. She told the truth to the frozen ground and felt lighter for it. Yael did not join her at the grave. He understood without being told that this was a private hour. But when she came back to the house, he was there, sitting on the porch steps with coffee in 2 cups, and he handed her one and did not ask her anything. And she sat beside him, and they drank their coffee in the cold morning air and watched a hawk circle over the east pasture. She said after a while, "He would have liked you." "I know," he said. "I liked him." "I want you to know that it doesn't conflict," she said. "Loving him and whatever this is, it doesn't feel like a betrayal." He turned to look at her. "I never thought it did. Some men would." "I'm not those men," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment. He put his arm around her without making a production of it. "What do you want?" she said. In the long run, be specific. He was quiet for a moment, but not the kind of quiet that meant he didn't have an answer. I want the cattle operation to be viable in 3 years, he said. I want the land to be good land, maintained the way it deserves. I want to know my neighbors and be known by them without the weight of old stories. I want to come home to something that means something. He paused. I want this, he said simply. This, she said. You, he said. This place, this morning, all of it. She absorbed that. She said, I need you to understand what this land is. It's not just a piece of property. My father built this. Thomas built more of it. I have put everything I am into keeping it going this past year. If you are part of this, it means you are part of something that was built by other people and that I intend to keep building. That's a specific kind of thing to be part of. I understand that, he said. I respect it. I wouldn't ask you to set it aside or change it. She looked at him. Thomas left it to me entirely. The deed is in my name. Whatever happens, that does not change. Of course it doesn't, he said. And the fact that he said it without any hesitation, without any of the bristling that some men would have done, told her something important. All right, she said. All right, he said. All right, she said. Then I think we should stop pretending we are just neighbors who have supper sometimes and start being honest about what we are. Which is what? He said, and she could hear the careful hope in the question, contained as always, but there. 2 people who want to be together, she said. That seems like enough to start with. He turned and looked at her fully then, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. And she thought, there he is, the real one, the one underneath all that careful quietness, and she was so glad she had been patient enough to get here. He kissed her again, in the cold morning air on the porch, properly this time, with none of the shed's dim uncertainty, in full light, and it was good. March brought mud and new calves and a land survey dispute that occupied both of them for a week and a half. A man named Carlton from the county had drawn the boundary line between their properties half a degree off, and it created a confusing situation about whose fence line was whose along the creek. They sat at her kitchen table with maps spread between them and argued about it in a way that was entirely productive, because they were both right in different ways and eventually arrived at a solution that required them to restake 2 posts and file an amendment with the county office. At the end of that process, she looked at him across the maps and said, I like arguing with you. He looked up. You do. You listen, she said. You disagree when you disagree, but you actually hear what I say. Thomas was a good man, but he sometimes had trouble hearing me when I contradicted him. She said it without bitterness, honestly. You don't have that problem. You're usually right, he said, not always. More often than me on the property details, he said. You've been working this land for years. It would be foolish not to listen. She looked at him. She thought about all the men she had known who would not have said that, who would have found it threatening to acknowledge that a woman knew her own land better than they did, and she felt a wave of something warm and sure. Yael, she said. Yes. I want to make you a specific proposal. He put down his pencil. He gave her his full attention. I want you to stop sleeping on the wrong side of the creek, she said, a pause. His eyes were steady on hers. I want you to bring whatever you need from that house over here, she said. The cattle can range together. We'll work it out legally. I don't mean this as a casual arrangement. I mean it as what it is, which is a permanent one. He was very still. I am 31 years old, she said, because she had been practicing this for a while. I have 140 acres and a mortgage I am managing and cattle that need tending and a fence that apparently requires constant attention. I have been alone for over a year, and I know what it costs. I also know what this year has been, what you have been to me, and I know the difference between a thing that is temporary and a thing that is real. "This is real." He said nothing. She could see him processing the careful internal work he always did before he committed to anything. She said, "I am also of the view that the kind of man who spends 2 months fixing a woman's fence in the dark because he wants to help and does not think he has the right to offer is the kind of man who will spend the rest of his life doing exactly what he says and meaning what he does. I find that rare. I do not intend to let it ride back across the creek and stay there." He stood up from the table slowly. He came around to her side. She stood up and he took both her hands in his and he said, "Yes." "Yes," she said. "Yes," he said again, more definitively, and she felt it move through her like the first warm day after the longest winter. The practical arrangements took several weeks. The property on the east side of the creek was put up for lease, which solved the immediate financial question and gave them time to decide its long-term use. The cattle were moved to range together under one operation. They filed the appropriate paperwork in Caldwell. Martha Coles was extremely satisfied about all of it and made no effort to conceal this satisfaction. The ceremony was small, at the end of April, in the yard of the ranch house under the sky that was finally warm and blue and carrying the smell of fresh grass. The minister came from Caldwell and there were about 20 people, and the whole thing was over in 20 minutes, which was exactly right. She wore a dress she had made herself from good blue wool, and he wore a coat she had not seen before, dark and clean, that fit him properly. And she thought, standing opposite him under the open sky, that he looked like himself, which was the best thing she could think to say about a person's appearance at an important moment. He said his vows without any hesitation, and without looking away from her, and she said hers with the same clear-eyed certainty she had been bringing to every important thing for as long as she could remember. When it was done, he kissed her in front of 20 people without any visible embarrassment, and she laughed against his mouth. The summer was good. The cattle prospered. Late in the summer, in August, she told him she was pregnant. She told him directly, over breakfast, because that was how she handled things, and she watched his face go through several things in rapid succession. Shock and then something enormous, some feeling too big for his face to contain all at once. And then he put down his fork and came around the table and held her face in his hands and looked at her like she was the center of everything. He was not a man who cried, but his eyes were very bright. "Good," he managed. "That is very good." "I thought so," she said slightly roughly. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Don't start hovering." "I'm not going to hover," he said. "I am going to be attentive." "There is a difference," she laughed. He spent the following week being extremely visibly not hovering, which meant doing everything he had always done, but with a new quality of awareness that she found both touching and occasionally amusing. He was up before her in the mornings to start the stove, not dramatically, just quietly, so the kitchen was warm when she came down. He rearranged his workday so he was closer to the house than the far pasture without mentioning he had done so. When she called him on this, he said he was reviewing the south fence line, which needed attention. "The south fence line is perfectly fine," she said. "I'm being thorough," he said. She let it go. She was, as she had said, perfectly well. She worked through the autumn in her usual way, modified by the increasing physical demands of late pregnancy, which she managed with the same practical efficiency she brought to every challenge. He was present for all of it, steady and close, doing what was needed, saying less than he felt, which she now understood was simply his nature, and she had stopped expecting him to fill space with words. She could read what he meant in the way he moved around her, in the small, deliberate acts of care, in the quality of his attention. November came, and with it the cold, and she went into labor on a clear, cold Tuesday morning, and it was hard, as these things were, and long. And he was in the house, not in the room but close, and she was aware of his presence on the other side of the door the way she had been aware of his presence on the other side of the fence all those months ago, quiet and watchful and there. The baby was born in the afternoon. A boy. He was robust and loud and had his father's gray eyes, which she discovered at about 3 weeks when they stopped being the newborn blue and settled into something still and quiet and very Yael. They named him Thomas because it was the right name, and Yael had proposed it before she did, which told her everything she needed to know. She told him this. He said, "It was the obvious choice." "Not to every man," she said. "I am not every man," he said, without arrogance, just plainly. "No," she said. "You certainly are not." Thomas Yael Farrow grew quickly, the way farm children did, into a solid and curious boy who wanted to know the name of every animal and every tool and every feature of the land his parents had built together. He followed his father around the property from the time he could walk reliably, and Yael answered every question with a patient thoroughness that she observed from the porch or the kitchen window, with a quality of warmth she had stopped trying to name because it was simply the texture of her life now. This warmth, this fullness. 3 years after Thomas was born, in the spring, she found herself at the kitchen window watching Yael teaching their son to ride the small bay pony they had acquired in the fall, patient and careful as he was with everything, one hand light on the bridle, his voice too low for her to hear from the window but clearly calm and instructive. Thomas sat straight and serious on the pony's back, 5 years old, and fully committed to the enterprise of learning everything there was to know. She put her hand on her rounded middle, where a second child was making its active presence known, and felt the absolute solidity of the life she was standing in. Later that evening, with Thomas asleep and the house quiet around them, she and Yael sat on the porch in the mild spring dark, the way they did most evenings when the weather allowed, side by side in the wooden chairs he had made last winter, with the land around them dark and breathing and entirely theirs. "Do you remember," she said, "the first night you came to fix the fence?" "Yes," he said. "What were you thinking?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that I could do one useful thing without complicating anything," he said. "I thought it would be the one time." "And then you kept coming back. The fence kept needing work," he said. She turned her head to look at him. "The fence," she said. He looked at her. The night was warm and the stars were very clear, and his face was the face she had been reading for 3 years, still contained, still quiet, but open to her in a way she understood was exclusive, that he kept just for this for her in these evening hours. "The fence," he said, "and other reasons." "What other reasons?" she said, though she knew. He reached out and took her hand, the way he had taken it in the snow on Christmas night the first time, careful and certain. He said, "I kept coming back because I could not make myself stop." She turned to face him more fully. "Because?" He looked at her. He said, "Because every morning when I went back across the creek I had to argue with myself about whether there was a real reason to go back or whether I was inventing one. And every night I found a real reason." "That sounds exhausting," she said. "It was," he said. "You solved it by inviting me to supper." "I solved it," she said. "You did," he said without any reservation. "You've solved most of the hard things." "We solved them," she said. He looked at her. He said, "We." "Yes," she said. "We." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, an old habit of his that she had never expected from him the first time and that she would, she thought, never stop being moved by. "I did not think," he said, "when I was 22 years old and working for men who were wrong that this was something I would have." "What is this?" she said. He looked out at the land. "The dark acres of it, the fence line visible as a shadow against the lighter dark of the grass, the barn solid and quiet, the tree at the south corner where Thomas was buried and where their son played in the afternoons, all of it gathered together in the spring dark. "Everything," he said. She leaned into his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The baby moved. She felt it and took his hand and pressed it to her side and felt the expression on his face change even though she wasn't looking at it, felt it in the way he went still and then not still at all. "Hello," he said quietly to her, to the child, to the whole quiet shape of the life they had built together. The spring night was warm and the fence stood solid on every side. 2 months later, Rosalind gave birth to a daughter, a small, fierce girl with dark hair and her mother's determined expression, who arrived with considerably less patience than her brother had shown and announced herself to the world in no uncertain terms. They named her Clara, and she grew up to be exactly what she looked like from the first day, which was a person who knew exactly what she wanted and went directly toward it. And both her parents found this enormously funny and entirely familiar. Thomas grew into a young man who had his father's quiet attentiveness and his mother's practical courage, and who showed an early gift for the kind of careful observation that made him good at everything that required patience and thought. He was going to be, Rosalind told Yael one evening, either a very good rancher or something entirely unexpected, and Yael said probably both, and she agreed. The ranch expanded. Not grandly, not in the way of the large operations that had chewed up land all around them in those years, but solidly, in the Hale way that Rosalind's father had established and that she and Yael continued. They bought a small piece of additional acreage to the north when it came available, which gave them better access to water in the dry summers. She watched this from the road on her way back from Caldwell and pulled her horse to a stop, and sat there for a moment watching him show a young man how to set a post so it would hold through the frost, patient and clear and unhurried. And she felt the deep pull of it, how far they had come from that first night, how long the road was between a man working in the dark alone and a man standing in broad daylight on his own terms, teaching someone how to build something that would last. He looked up and saw her watching him. Something crossed his face that she recognized as the quiet, specific expression that was only for her. She raised one hand. He raised his. She rode on toward home. That evening she told him what she had been thinking when she watched him from the road, not all of it, but the important part. She said, "I am very glad you fixed my fence." He looked at her. "I'm glad I did too," he said. "You know what I mean." "I do," he said. "I know exactly what you mean." Outside the kitchen window, the Kansas land was going gold in the late light, the grass bending in the evening wind, the fence line running steady and straight on every side, holding everything in. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it, and they sat with that for a while, with the children audible somewhere in the house behind them, with the land outside, with everything they had made together laid out around them like a country of their own, earned and solid and real. She thought about the first morning she had found the fence post lying in the grass, the clean break, the evidence of a hand she did not know, the cold vertigo of being seen by someone she couldn't see. She thought about sitting in the dark with her rifle across her knees and listening to the sound of a careful man doing a kind thing in the dark. She thought about the kitchen table, and the wine and the Christmas snow and the woodshed and the February grave, and every supper and every argument, and every morning in the long, ordinary intimacy of a life built with another person, laid stone by stone. She thought about all the things she had not expected to find, and all the things she had not expected to feel, and the specific way that love arrived sometimes not in a storm, but in a series of small, careful acts in the dark, invisible and patient and persistent, building something so gradually you did not know what it was until you were standing inside it, surrounded by it, held by it. Outside, the fence held. Inside, the light was warm. Yael Farrow, who had once believed he did not deserve a good thing, sat in his kitchen on his land beside the woman who had looked at him and told him he was wrong about that, and he was, in every way that counted, entirely home.